My CEO slapped me in front of everyone with no reason. I was shocked, ashamed and blank why this happened. But what happened next shocked everyone. Stay with me till the end to know the reason of this disgusting act. The sound arrived like a punctuation mark, clean, impossible to ignore. It was not the sharp sting of skin, but the hollow echo that follows a thing meant to shame. For a breath, the room stopped its busy noise. Papers rustled like small birds startled. Someone's coffee cup paused mid-lift. My name hung in the air and then fell, unwanted. I felt the slap on my cheek as if someone had cracked open a heavy book on a quiet kitchen table. Loud enough to make the neighbors look up, small enough that she expected no real consequence. She sat back and smiled the way people smile after a joke they don't intend to explain. Her perfume, jasmine with a bitter edge like sugar gone past sweet, stayed in my hair. My hand went to my face because habit says you touch what has been touched. But I didn't wipe it. I let it warm under my palm and felt the heat remember her palm for me. I remember thinking, in that exact second, that humiliation is a particular kind of fire. It burns slow and teaches you what can be used later. I did not shout. I did not even look around for help. The room had witnesses, yes, but revenge does not start with witnesses. It starts with a ledger. It starts with patience. I walked out of the boardroom with my chest tight and my voice flat. I made eye contact with people just enough for them to know I had left. They needed proof I had not fled in some private collapse. The elevator hummed the polite song of a building that believes in order. Someone said, "Are you all right?" And I answered with a practiced calm I had been refining since childhood. "I will be." The words were small and true and false at once. At home, I changed my shirt and looked in the mirror until I saw something that was not just the bruise. I rehearsed the face I would wear for weeks. Composed, not cold. Measured, not hollow. I told myself that the loud moment belonged to her, and the long grind would belong to me. The slap had done one thing well. It revealed who she was to the room. My task now was to reveal who she really was to everyone who mattered. That night, I made tea and opened a drawer I had avoided. It contained receipts, flights, reimbursements that once seemed like the small, boring machinery of a business. It felt obscene to touch them. They smelled faintly of printer ink and the ghost of her perfume. I began to read with the attention of someone parsing a language she thought she knew and suddenly did not. Names repeated like a beat in a song. Accounts routed to shell companies with initials that matched a name I had seen on her calendar. Dinners labeled Client Entertainment that matched hotel invoices 2 blocks from her apartment. Each page was not accusation yet. Each page was a small true thing that could be shown. I folded the papers into an envelope and slid it under a book on my shelf, where dust would not reach it quickly, but where my hand could. The act felt ceremonial. I was neither righteous nor thrilled. I felt a strange, plain relief, as if someone had finally given me permission to catalog the truth. Would I become her in the process of undoing her? That question arrived like a cold trickle, and I pinned it beside the slap on the wall of my mind. The days that followed were a study in smallness and strategy. I returned to work and wore obedience like armor. "Yes, ma'am," I said in the exact soft cadence that disarmed her. She rewarded me with the casual gifts of trust. Passwords written on sticky notes, messages left unsent in the drafts folder, the kind of detail only offered to someone you think won't look. There is cruelty in being underestimated. It leaves you space to learn. I learned that she checked 2 phones for the same message at 9:14 each morning. I learned that Kemi, her assistant, always answered the call she didn't want her boss to take. I learned the times she left early and the restaurants she called client dinners. Each small fact fit into a larger shape in my head. I began to place questions like seeds in conversations. An offhand inquiry about an expense here, a curious look at a project sheet there. People lean toward information like moths to a window. If you give them a breath of curiosity, they will supply the rest. There were nights I could not sleep. The slap played like a record, and then skipped. Play, skip, repeat. In the dark, I would open my notebook and write the dates, times, and names until the ink blurred. Sometimes I felt pity for her. Once, through a glass door, I saw her laugh with someone, and the laugh was like someone using a prop to pretend at joy. She looked fragile in those moments, all polish and fear. I liked the idea that perhaps she was small inside, afraid she'd always be small. But pity dissolves quickly when you remember how many people had been bruised by her ascent. What mattered was not why she had become cruel, but that she had chosen that shape for herself. The ledger became my ledger, not for vengeance alone, but for truth to be carried where it could do the most harm to the false story she had told about herself. I began to feed the room with truth in tiny, surgical ways. I flagged an expense to the audit team with a quiet note. I forwarded a curious email to a mentor on the board with a simple question. Do you recall this? I left a printed invoice on a CFO's desk, as if it had been misfiled. People are not brave when prompted by facts that smell like consensus. They are prudent. They ask questions. The team that once threw confetti at her name began to open their mouths in rooms where she could not control the narrative. The unraveling had no fireworks. It had a rhythm, questions, documents, a pause, more questions. In that rhythm I felt something ache and steady. The sense that I had not been made small forever. I had been given a long job. I had become, quietly, something she had never expected. A slow-moving consequence. When the day came for everything to be laid out, it was not grand. It was a Thursday, as ordinary as any, with coffee gone tepid and the projector light steady and patient. She entered with the same practiced confidence and then froze when eyes found the papers on the table. The room smelled of stale perfume and fear. The first sheet I slid forward had a small, neat header and numbers that would not forgive. The air thinned like breath held beneath water. She tried to speak, the automatic commands threading at the corners of her lips. But the documents told a different story. Wire transfers to an LLC with her initials. Expense reports that mapped late-night addresses. Contracts with signatures that did not match what was presented in meetings. I watched her face shift from practiced control to a kind of unraveling that looked almost like grief. People who once laughed at her jokes looked down at their hands. Investors, the people whose applause had fed her, asked the blunt questions that remove costumes. Who signed this? Who approved that? Her voice cracked in a place I had never heard it crack. I felt no cheering in my chest, only a strange, heavy silence that asked if the work had been worth the cost. As she left the room later, smaller and quieter than the woman who had raised a palm to my face, I heard someone murmur, "I didn't see it." That line surprised me because I had not wanted them to see everything at once. I had wanted them to see the paper and then the truth. The empire she had built on borrowed shine did not crumble like a house of cards. It disintegrated like rusted iron, small failures made public until the structure could no longer support itself. Standing in the lobby, I touched my cheek and felt the memory of her hand. It was not a thrill of victory that warmed me. It was a deep, steady thing, a completion of an accounting. Justice, maybe. Or perhaps simply consequence rendered in the plain language of facts. I walked out into the cold and the city moved around me, unaware of the slow correction that had taken place behind glass. I started watching her the way a hunter studies movement in tall grass, still enough to look invisible, alert enough to register every flicker. She didn't notice. She never did. Power makes people careless. It dulls the instincts that keep you safe. She smiled often, that bright, immaculate grin that looked effortless from a distance but up close showed strain, the faint tremor at the corner of her mouth. Every good job was rehearsed, every laugh slightly too delayed. I began to see what no one else wanted to see, the cracks running under the gloss. Her assistant, Kemi, gave her away first. A nervous glance here, a stammered, "I'll handle it," there, emails sent twice by accident, whispered phone calls that ended when I walked into the room. I started collecting these fragments the way children collect seashells, innocently, almost lovingly. Each detail had its texture, its smell, its weight. Every night I would sit in my kitchen, coffee gone cold, and line them up in my mind until they formed a pattern. Patterns don't lie. People do. At work I kept my mask on. Yes, ma'am. Of course, ma'am. I made those words soft, deferential. I played the part so well that even I began to believe I was harmless. But acting requires control, and control has its price. Sometimes, standing in front of the mirror, I'd watch my mouth shape those same empty phrases and feel disgust crawl up my throat. Was I becoming her? The question had teeth. Late at night, when the office lights dimmed and her glass door glowed faintly blue from her computer screen, I'd pause in the corridor and listen to her voice drift through the wall. Confident, urgent, desperate. "We'll fix it before the audit," she said once, not knowing I stood just outside. The next morning, she greeted me with that flawless smile and a compliment I didn't deserve. The performance almost impressed me. Almost. The more I learned, the less angry I became. Anger is heat. It burns fast. What I felt was colder, steadier, and understanding. I studied her like a case file. Fake investors, altered invoices, conversations that began with, "Keep this between us." The deeper I looked, the more her empire looked like scaffolding built on lies. She wasn't untouchable. She was just clever enough to hide her fear. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between discovery and decision, guilt tried to speak. I'd catch my reflection in my laptop screen and think, maybe I'm pushing too far. Maybe this isn't justice, it's infection. But then the memory would surface. That sharp slap, the sound of it echoing through the boardroom while everyone stared. I'd feel the phantom heat on my cheek again, and guilt would fade like fog in sunlight. Understanding your enemy is a kind of intimacy. You begin to think their thoughts, anticipate their moves, taste their fears. It's dangerous how intoxicating that can be. I knew her coffee order, her tells, the way her eyes darted right before she lied. I understood her the way mirrors understand faces, reflecting what others miss. And in that reflection, I saw myself changing. The line between justice and cruelty blurred. But I let it. I told myself it didn't matter yet. The time for mercy had passed the moment her hand met my face. Revenge wasn't coming from anger anymore. It was coming from knowledge, sharp, precise, and patient. The first domino was ready. I only needed to decide when to touch it. I began to place my discoveries where they'd fester quietly. Not all evidence needs shouting. Some proof spreads like a slow leak until people notice damp stains and start asking why. I left a misfiled invoice on Raza's desk with no comment, only a date circled in red. I printed an email chain and tucked it into a folder I casually left in the boardroom's bookshelf between industry reports. I copied a transfer receipt to a flash drive and labeled it "Backup" before slipping it into my bag. Small gestures, almost absent-minded, but they found the right hands. Raza frowned at the invoice and opened his own files. The mentor on the board read the folder and made a note in the margin. That was all it took. People do not want to be wrong about someone they admire. When given reason to doubt, they check. When given proof, they move. Doing this felt like walking a tightrope. Every time I left a document or asked a soft question, I measured the risk. I kept my voice soft in meetings and my eyes polite. I smiled at the right times and kept my shoulders loose. She continued to trust me because she had never thought I would become the thing that undid her. Pride has a blind spot called overconfidence. The more she assumed I was harmless, the closer I could come to the truth she hid. There were nights I'd lie awake imagining her reaction when she finally unfolded all the papers and saw the pattern. Would she break? Would she beg? Would she try to blame me? I could not know the shape of her despair, only that it would be private and raw in a way the slap had not been. That thought kept me steady. Sometimes kindness complicated the ledger. I found myself buying her favorite tea to leave on her desk once when the office felt unusually tense. I told myself it was a soft camouflage, a courtesy to human decency. But when she smiled and thanked me, the smile was the one that remembered she had once been helped. It was awful how much that small gratitude stirred something like warmth in me. For a moment, I nearly stopped. I nearly slid the file back into the drawer and returned to being the person who covered mistakes for the greater good. But then I felt the heat on my cheek again, a vivid, private flash that pinned me to the moment the last time she humiliated me. Memory is precise in that way. It can be a weapon or a compass. I chose compass. There were missteps. Once I left a note on the wrong desk. An invoice I meant for the audit team ended up in the printer tray of a junior analyst. My stomach dropped for hours as I imagined the wrong person seeing it and ruining the careful cadence I had built. The analyst, bless her, assumed it was a request for reconciliation and passed it up the chain. My error became luck. The chain reaction began. Luck and planning move in strange dances together. I learned to be both rigorous and forgiving of my own small mistakes. Perfection is the enemy of progress. As the weeks folded into one another, the office atmosphere shifted the way a room changes after a secret is admitted. Slightly lower, more cautious, the jokes thinner. People began to glance at each other with a new kind of attention, as if evaluating allegiances. Conversations that used to glossed over now stopped on awkward edges. I watched colleagues check their phones in meetings, their thumbs twitching like nervous birds. The assistant, Kemi, who once hovered near her boss's door, started arriving late and leaving earlier. Habits rearranged themselves to avoid the heat. The smallest things revealed the largest truths. Who left the group chat, who avoided eye contact, who suddenly had appointment after appointment, off-site. I read changes like a map. Still, nights were the hardest. I would sit at my desk long after the lights went off, the glow of my laptop the only thing keeping the dark from settling in. I opened the files again and again, like a person rereading a letter that contains a secret. Each time I felt something shift inside, a hardening at the edges, a softening in the middle. When doubt crept in, it was not about whether she had done these things. It was whether I had become someone who lived for the unraveling of another life. I would touch my jaw where the bruise sometimes still left a faint ache, and ask myself what kind of person would feel satisfaction at the sound of someone else's collapse. The honest answers were complicated and ugly. Relief, permission, a small, unnameable clarity. The ledger did not make me righteous. It made me resolute. There were moments when I caught her alone at the copier, shoulders slumped, her face stripped of armor. She spoke quietly into her phone about money and numbers and loneliness in a way I had never heard. Once, our eyes met in the fluorescent light, and for a second, the woman looked like someone who could be saved by apology. I thought of stepping forward, placing a hand on hers, offering something like mercy. Every instinct that had once made me kind tugged at the hem of that choice. But mercy would have risked everything. The ledger would have remained a secret, and the pattern would have kept eating at the company from the inside. I had to decide which version of myself I wanted to be, the easy forgiver or the steward of truth. I chose truth. The plan continued to crawl forward, not with spectacle but with small adjustments that felt inevitable. A finance committee meeting took on a different gravity when Raza casually referenced an item in a memo I had flagged. The investor calls began to include questions about oversight and governance. Whispers turned into formal queries. The ground around her shifted in the way a tide changes the look of a shoreline. You notice the new rocks only after the water recedes. One Thursday, a board member asked a question about an expense from last quarter, and she hesitated, just a fraction, long enough for everyone else to feel it. That pause was a crack. I had not put a gun to anyone's head. I had given them a reason to look. When the evidence finally met people who could act, The reaction was less theatrical and more methodical. There was a pause where the room listened to paper, and then a series of practical steps: audits, requests for explanations, meetings scheduled during times she liked to be unobserved. The building that had applauded her was suddenly full of people with clipboards and questions. She began to move through corridors like someone walking a maze while the walls shift. I felt an odd, complicated sympathy that morning as I watched the shadow of her figure crossing the lobby. She had made her bed. The pattern was in the sheets. I placed another document where I had planned and watched as it was picked up and read by someone who had the authority to follow through. My role was small, surgical, and now unstoppable. The rumors turned into meetings, and the meetings turned into inquiries. Each time she was asked to clarify a number or explain a missing signature, the quiet around her grew heavier. The office that once inhaled her perfume now held its breath when she passed. I pretended not to notice. That was my role. Calm, helpful, a face she could still lean on. It was cruel and it was necessary. Every lie she had built her throne on was now standing on glass, and I could already hear it cracking. The first real break came on a Tuesday. She called me into her office, voice trembling under the surface. The blinds were half closed, stripes of white light cutting across her face. "Someone's leaking internal reports," she said. "Someone wants to destroy me." The word destroy tasted sharp when she said it. I watched her, the way a storm chaser watches clouds darken, half fascinated, half terrified. Her voice wavered, and for a second I saw the child behind the arrogance, desperate to keep control. She reached for her coffee, missed, and laughed like it was a joke. I should have felt triumph. Instead, I felt something closer to grief. Not for her, but for what I'd lost to become this version of myself. I'd built my entire existence around one moment of humiliation, and now that the end was near, it felt empty. The slap had turned me into an architect of consequence, and consequence, I was learning, has no joy, only gravity. Still, I couldn't stop. Revenge doesn't slow down once it starts moving. It becomes a current that drags you with it, whispering that you're doing what must be done. She called another emergency meeting that afternoon. Investors, partners, the board, same room, same air thick with perfume and fear. Only this time her voice shook. The audit results had come in. Numbers missing, transfers traced, names attached. Every word she spoke cracked another layer of her image. I stood at the edge of the room, silent, watching the inevitable unfold like a film I'd already seen. When it was over, the board thanked me for my transparency. They called it professionalism. I called it survival. She didn't look at me as she left the room. Maybe she already knew. Maybe she had known for weeks. Outside, the evening light hit the windows like gold against cold steel. I walked past her office one last time. Her chair sat empty, her cup still half full, lipstick smudged on the rim, jasmine still hanging in the air. I touched my cheek without meaning to. The phantom burn was gone. The loyal employee was never coming back, but neither was the woman who'd slapped me. And in the silence that followed, I understood the most painful truth of all. In destroying her, I had finished what she started. I had become her. The plan did not arrive like a lightning strike. It assembled itself in the small hours, in the quiet movements no one notices until the structure is complete. I learned to be patient the way a gardener learns to wait for roots. She loved the light, awards, lunches with investors, the quick applause of people who mistook noise for talent. I learned to love the dark. The months after the slap were study and stillness. I read receipts until the paper smudged beneath my fingers. I traced transfers on my screen and watched them curl into names that didn't match any office address. A hotel invoice with her initials. A transfer to AO Consulting that led nowhere. Late-night messages from a name I recognized, Tunda, showing up on the same dates as client dinners on her calendar. Each small discovery was a cold thing that fit into my palm like a stone. I kept them in an envelope under a book I never opened. The envelope felt heavier each time I slid another piece of paper inside. I practiced my face in the mirror so she would never suspect. "Yes, ma'am," I said until the words sounded like a soft rhythm I could wear. She rewarded me with trust, the way people reward a mirror. They see themselves reflected and believe the reflection is love. She left passwords on sticky notes. She asked me to send confirmations to an email she never used in the office. Kemi, her assistant, moved like a shadow and sometimes left a file on the wrong desk. Those mistakes were treasures. I learned that she checked 2 phones for messages at 9:14 every morning because someone important sent him a text then. Little rituals tell you more than speeches. When you know the rituals, you can gently break them and watch the person try to pretend nothing is wrong. There were nights I could not sleep. The slap came back to me in the small hours, a hollow cracking that lived in my jaw. Sometimes pity visited. Seeing her on the elevator laughing at something that wasn't funny, watching her smooth a skirt that looked tired. Once, I almost left everything in the envelope and returned to the life of a woman who stayed late to help others. That impulse lasted for a single breath. Then I remembered how she had smiled when the board watched me with the kind of approval that feels like a knife. I remembered the way the room froze, the way no one stepped forward when she made me small. Pity turned to steel as the memory sharpened. If I spared her now, what would the ledger say next? Who would protect the quiet ones then? Justice, I told myself, is not cruel when it is necessary. It is surgical. So I moved in small, precise ways. I left a flagged expense report on Raza's desk with no explanation, like a suggestion made of paper. I printed an email chain and slipped it into a folder on the bookshelf used by the mentor who liked office gossip. I copied a transfer receipt to a flash drive and labeled it "Backup" before tucking it into my bag. Each action was casual, almost accidental. People do the work for you when you only give them the right question. Raza frowned and opened his own files. The mentor read the folder and made a note in the margin. The CFO, who had once nodded too quickly at her claims, started checking numbers twice. That is how unmaking begins. Not with fire, but with the quiet rearrangement of attention. I never lied. I gave the truth room to breathe until other people began to inhale it. I learned the taste of waiting. It is not empty. It is full of small calculations. Who will look at which paper first? Which person will notice an oddity and carry it like a seed to a meeting? I rehearsed how to be helpful when suspicion rose. Calm, reasonable, the face of someone who wanted the right thing for the company. That role let me stand near the stove while the pots simmered, never so near that I burned myself. Sometimes my hands shook when I placed a document in the right folder. Sometimes my stomach dropped because I had left an invoice in the printer tray instead of the audit bin. Those little mistakes sometimes became lucky breaks. The junior analyst who found the misfiled invoice passed it up. My error turned into the exact nudge the right person needed. I learned to be forgiving of my clumsy human slips because they taught me humility and gave me the chances I planned. 4. There were moments of strange tenderness that made the ledger feel like a betrayal of my own heart. Once, when the office was unusually quiet, I bought her favorite tea and left it on her desk with a small note that said, "Take 5. She smiled the smile she used when she wanted to be liked, and for a breath, I felt something that tasted like warmth. It surprised me how quickly that softness hardened into strategy. The smile loosened a detail she wanted to hide. That was the rule I lived by. When kindness softens another's guard, truth can slip through. The small dissentes became my camouflage, not my confession. Mercy would have made me small again. I could not risk that. At night, I kept a notebook where I wrote every date and name, the kind of ledger that leaves no room for stories to bend. Ink, I learned, remembers better than memory. I wrote the time of a wired payment, the name on the invoice, the restaurant address listed as a client meeting. I wrote the way she checked her phone at 9:14 and the way Kemi looked away when I entered a room. I wrote because a paper with facts cannot be dismissed as rumor. Facts are heavy. They make people look up from their comfortable assumptions and see the cracks. I was not vindictive. I was methodical. There is an ugly dignity to that distinction. Watching her falter was a private pain. She moved through the building with the same steps she always had, but shadows followed her now in a new way. Meetings that once hummed turned into cross-examinations in soft clothes. Questions became the tools for a slow demolition. I never shouted or pointed. I placed facts where they would be noticed and let other people do the dismantling. It felt like gardening someone else's ruin with my hands clean. Even so, I wondered in the long nights what I would feel at the end. Would I feel relief? Would I feel emptied? The ledger could make the truth visible, but it could not guarantee the shape of the person who built it. That uncertainty, more than anything, kept me awake. The final thread that pulled the curtain was small and quiet. I forwarded one flagged expense to audit with a casual line. "Notice this. Thought you should see." I dropped a printed invoice on the mentor's chair and pretended I had tread in a hurry. I asked one soft question in the board meeting at 3 in the afternoon, the exact time she liked to take calls in the sunlit corner office. It was a simple question about oversight. It made the room look. People looked because I had given them a reason to. Once the right eyes read the right paper and the right ears heard the right whisper, the pattern no longer belonged to me. It belonged to anyone who would listen. When the inquiries began in earnest, she became smaller in public. Pride does not shield you when people hold documents instead of applause. I watched the color drain from her face as auditors asked for originals, and the CFO asked for clarifications he had never thought to ask before. Her voice, which used to smooth over problems, cracked under the weight of facts. I did not feel triumph so much as a heavy finality, the sense that a book had closed the exact way it was always written to. We had not done anything spectacular. We had merely let truth do what it does when given air. I walked out of the building that day with the weight of the envelope gone, but not with wings. The envelope had emptied into other hands and the consequence had begun to move. People would tell the story of her fall in different ways. Some would call it justice. Others would call it necessary cruelty. I would call it an accounting. The woman who once raised her hand to my face had taught me, in a single loud moment, what I could not do without: patience. The strategist in me had finished the blueprint. The moral cost of following it remained a private ledger I balanced nightly. When I touched my cheek that evening, the bruise was faint, a memory more than an injury. The echo of the slap lived in me like a tide that pulled and released. I had built something to answer it, and now I had to live inside what I had built. The plan had written itself in silence, and the silence had done its work. I did not shout. I had smiled, and then I had waited. The waiting had taught me that revenge rarely looks like a scene. It looks like the slow correction of a lie until no one can pretend the lie was ever true. It happened on a Thursday. The same boardroom, the same faces, the same perfume that once suffocated the air. Jasmine, arrogance, and power. But this time, it wasn't her scent that filled the room. It was tension, sharp, metallic, electric. The kind that warns you something irreversible is about to happen. She walked in late, of course. That was her ritual, to make everyone wait. Her heels clicked on the marble floor, like a metronome counting down to her end. I stood near the head of the table, calm, almost serene. Papers stacked neatly before me, the truth bound in ink and signatures. My heartbeat wasn't fast anymore. It was steady, measured. The loyal employee had been buried long ago. What stood here now was something else. Deliberate, controlled, inevitable. Her eyes found mine first. There was no recognition at first, only irritation. That same dismissive glance she'd given me 100 times before. But when she noticed the documents, when she saw the investors watching her, something changed. Confusion. Then disbelief. Then fear. The transformation was almost poetic. like watching a storm form over still water. I slid the first folder across the table. It landed in front of her with a soft thud, but the sound felt like an explosion. "You might want to explain these," I said, my voice low but steady. No anger, no triumph, just quiet control. She flipped the pages, scanning quickly. Forged numbers, false partnerships, money rerouted through shell accounts. Every lie she'd built her empire on, printed and waiting for judgment. Her face drained of color. "Where did you get this?" she asked, voice breaking around the edges. I smiled, the kind of smile that isn't joy, but closure. "You left it everywhere," I said. "You just didn't think anyone would look," the board murmured. The investors leaned forward. The walls felt closer. Her composure, that thing she wore like armor, cracked, piece by piece. "This isn't what it looks like," she started, voice trembling. "These were strategic theft?" I interrupted. "Creative accounting?" I let the words hang in the air. They didn't need explanation. The silence did the work for me. I saw her glance toward Kemi, the assistant who once shielded her from everything. Kemi couldn't meet her eyes. That was when she realized it. She was alone. "Remember," I said softly, "when you told me I'd never be more than your shadow?" I leaned forward, voice calm, almost tender. "Watch me eclipse you." The gasp that followed wasn't mine. It came from the room. The kind of sound people make when they realize the world they believed in just tilted. She tried to speak, to spin, to charm. But charm only works on people who still believe in you. They didn't. Not anymore. By the time she stood up, her empire was already collapsing around her, quietly, efficiently. Each secret I'd uncovered was a knife turned outward, cutting the web she'd woven. The investors excused themselves first, then the CFO, then the silence. She looked smaller than I'd ever seen her. A woman stripped of her myth. "You did this," she whispered, as if it were a revelation. I didn't answer. Because the truth was simpler. She did this. I just made sure everyone saw it. When I left the room, no one stopped me. No one spoke. The sound of her breathing, shallow, uneven, followed me out the door. Outside, the sunlight was too bright, too clean. The glass walls of the building reflected everything, except her. And as I stood there, the city moving indifferently around me, I waited for the feeling that never came. Not joy, not relief, just silence. Revenge, I realized, doesn't roar when it's done. It exhales, quiet, final. The investors left first. They never like to stay when failure smells too close. The rest followed, one by one, the scrape of chairs loud against the polished floor. I stood by the window, looking at the skyline blurring behind the glass. The city moved as if nothing inside this room had just ended. Behind me, she sat still, hands gripping the table's edge, nails digging into the wood, as though holding on could stop the collapse. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The air was already doing it for me. Her voice came out small, cracked. "You think this makes you better than me?" she said. I turned, slow. Her eyes were red, mascara running in thin black threads. "No," I said. "It makes me free." There it was, truth, cold and final. The kind that doesn't echo, just lands. She reached for the papers again, as if rereading them would change what they said. Each page a confession written in her own hand. Every transaction, every lie, exposed under fluorescent light. The empire she built on deceit now existed only as evidence against her. When security entered, I didn't look back. The sound of her breaking wasn't loud. It was a whimper, a single exhausted sob that dissolved into silence. Outside, the late afternoon sun painted everything gold. I should have felt something. Pride, victory, maybe peace. But revenge doesn't give you closure. It gives you emptiness that looks like control. I walked away anyway, because sometimes silence is the loudest ending. The night after it all ended, the office still lived in my head. Every flicker of light, every breath that filled the silence before she fell. I tried to sleep, but silence is never truly quiet. It hums with memory. I could still see her face. The disbelief, the fear, the pride trying to survive behind trembling lips. And beneath all that, something that looked almost human. Regret, maybe. I made tea and sat by the window, watching the city move beneath me. Her name had already started trending. Headlines sprouted like weeds. CEO under investigation. Allegations of fraud and misconduct. The world was watching what I'd seen all along. And yet, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like someone had ripped open a wound that had been stitched shut too long. My phone buzzed. A message. From her. Just 3 words. You were right. I stared at it for a long time, waiting for anger or satisfaction, but neither came. Only the echo of her voice in my memory. The laughter, the slap, the perfume. The sound that once split my soul now whispered through the quiet like a lesson. I didn't reply. Some stories don't need closure. They just stop telling themselves. I turned off my phone, exhaled, and let the silence settle again. Revenge, I realized, was never about balance. It was about truth, raw, ugly, necessary. And when the truth finally stood on its own, I didn't need to stand beside it anymore. Revenge is loud when it begins, but quiet when it ends. The noise fades, and all that's left is the hum of consequence. I used to think I'd feel peace, that justice would soothe the ache where humiliation had once lived. But peace doesn't come wrapped in silence. It comes with distance. Distance from her, from them, from the person I used to be before the sound of a slap rewired my soul. The city doesn't remember her name anymore. That's the cruel mercy of time. It forgets the fallen fast. But I remember. I remember the way her laughter used to bounce off glass walls, how every word she said was a performance for people too afraid to look behind the curtain. Now the curtain's gone. The empire is ash, and I'm still here, standing in the smoke. She sent one message after the storm settled. You were right. Just 3 words. No apology. No admission. Just surrender. I stared at that text for a long time, then deleted it. Not out of anger, but clarity. Some stories don't need replies. They just need to end. And yet, some nights, when the world is still, I hear that sound again. Sharp, echoing, hollow. The slap. Only now it's followed by something else. The slow clap of karma. Because betrayal doesn't vanish. It lingers. It waits in quiet rooms and old reflections. And so do I. It started the way endings always do. With quiet. No headlines, no fireworks, no applause. Just quiet. The kind that follows after something enormous collapses and the dust has nowhere left to go. I should have felt free, but freedom has a strange aftertaste. It's metallic, heavy. It lingers on your tongue like guilt pretending to be victory. I sat in the same chair where I used to draft her emails, now empty, and tried to remember what it felt like to care about the sound of her heels clicking on the floor. Nothing came. Days passed in a kind of gray. The company moved on without her, the way a body continues breathing after losing too much blood. People talked about rebuilding and restoring trust, but their eyes were tired. I wasn't tired. I was hollow in a way that felt almost clean. I'd done what I came to do. The slap had been answered, the balance restored. But justice doesn't hold you the way rage does. Rage burns, justice cools, and the silence that follows justice can feel like a grave. One evening, I walked past her old office. The nameplate had been removed. The blinds hung unevenly, one slat broken like a snapped rib. Her scent was gone. No more jasmine, no more arrogance, just dust and paper. I stood there longer than I should have, listening to the quiet hum of the building, half expecting her voice to come slicing through the air. It didn't. Only the soft hiss of the air conditioning answered. I told myself I didn't miss her. I told myself she was a villain, and villains aren't meant to be mourned. But the truth is, we mourn the ghosts of who people were before they became monsters. And somewhere in the haze of memory, there was still a version of her who laughed without cruelty. That version was long gone. Maybe I helped bury her. Maybe she buried herself. I'll never know. That night, I went home and poured myself a drink I didn't finish. The phone buzzed once. Unknown number. The message was short. You were right. I read it again and again until the words blurred. 3 simple syllables, and yet they cracked something inside me. It wasn't regret I felt. It was recognition. Maybe she wasn't apologizing. Maybe she was surrendering. Maybe she finally saw what I'd seen all along, that empires built on ego always collapse from within. I didn't reply. Some stories deserve silence. Closure isn't always a conversation. Sometimes it's a locked door you never open again. I left the phone on the table for hours after deleting her message, just watching its dark screen reflect the ceiling light. You would think that after everything, the words "you were right" would feel like a prize. They didn't. They sounded like a prayer said too late. For the first time in months, I let the silence fill me without fighting it. I thought about the boardroom, about the way her voice broke, about how small she looked when the truth finally cornered her. Revenge had ended exactly as I planned it. But it hadn't ended me. I was still here, breathing in the aftermath. Sometimes I think I miss the fight. There's a strange purpose in hatred. It focuses you, sharpens you. Once it's gone, you're left holding dull edges and wondering what to cut next. I walked through the office one last time that week. The walls hummed with fluorescent light, the same hum that had once carried her laughter. I stopped by the glass wall where it had happened. That slap, the sound that started everything. I touched the glass. It was cold. The reflection staring back wasn't the same woman who had stood there before. She looked older, calmer, but also emptied out. Maybe that was the cost of justice. You trade fire for silence. I don't talk about it now. I don't need to. People whisper her name when they think I can't hear. They say it like a cautionary tale. Sometimes I still hear that sound, the slap, the laughter, the gasp. But it's always followed by something else. The slow, steady clap of karma echoing from somewhere deep inside me. It isn't loud. It doesn't need to be. It's a rhythm that keeps time with my heart. A reminder that betrayal never disappears. It just waits, quiet and patient, for its turn to be seen. If she's listening, she'll know. She'll hear it too. Because some debts aren't paid in words. They're paid in echoes.